Coming up on this week's show, run classic Windows on your Game Boy.
YouTube turns 20.
And we chat with id Software legend, American McGee.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each and every Friday with our amazing friends at Bitmap Books. And of course today, American McGee's a guest, talking lots about classic FPS games. And have you seen their book, I'm Too Young to Die, The Ultimate Guide to First-Person Shooters, covering the golden era, 1992 to 2002. All the big ones are in there: Doom, Quake, Half-Life, some that you've probably forgotten as well, and some that maybe flew under the radar. Weighing in at more than 420 pages. If you're a fan of FPS games, check this out and the rest of their retro gaming collection at bitmapbooks.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 477, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a great to have you joining us for the podcast that every Friday, of course, brings you up to speed on all the big happenings in the wonderful world of retro gaming and technology, and brings you veterans of the industry onto the show for an interview in the second half. And we have got a legendary guest on this week's show. More about that in just a minute. Nice to have full crew back there. Welcome back, Joe.
I'm back, baby.
You are. Nice to Bill to cover last week as well. Did you have a listen?
Yes, I did. He was amazing. And he put a sweet comment on Facebook.
Yes.
To say it was an honour to cover, but it was an absolute honour to have Bill cover for me, which was kind of blew my mind because I was like, oh, Bill's massive. Like, yeah. You know.
Like, a very Amiga heavy episode, Joe, so you didn't miss out on much.
Yeah. But yeah, no, fantastic episode as always, and allowed me to go on my hollybobs.
Yeah, but it was honestly awesome to have Bill on. But great to have you back. Like Ravi said, you rein us in a bit, otherwise it does turn into the Amiga Hour, as we know. So we have got lots to chat about all things retro coming up soon. I mean, actually, speaking of retro, I don't know if you've you actually watched this as well, haven't you, Joe, since you got back off your holidays? A new series of Black Mirror. I've seen a lot of people have been talking about episode 4, which is all about retro gaming, an episode called Plaything, which is kind of it's a bit of a spiritual successor to the Bandersnatch episode they did a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil it, because obviously a lot of people might not have watched it yet, etc.
I've not.
Including Ravi, yeah.
But yeah, it, spiritual successor, there's it's not even, I was going to say like, oh, there's a link there. It's a very obvious link, but it's still its own self-contained story. There's only kind of like 2 scenes that kind of link it to Bandersnatch, but it's still very cool to see. But I think the thing that got me and Dan talking on Messenger the most was the nods to retro tech and retro kind of British culture, because it's set in 94, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's so much in there. Like, and there was things that you spotted that I didn't spot, and then that I spotted and you didn't spot, which was pretty funny to talk about, which kind of, takes a little bit away from the episode, which is a really cool episode. You know what? My missus got so annoyed because I kept pausing it to send you and Ravi like pictures of, oh, look what's on screen, and the Atari Jaguar poster.
That's the problem. I've not seen it yet, and I've been seeing screenshots of everything, not just from you, of people that have seen albums in the background and stuff like that. And it's good when we had Charlie Brooker on, Bandersnatch was the first one that was kind of doing that. So it's good to hear there's a bit of a follow-up episode. I'm really excited to watch it.
Yeah, there's actually a great article on Time Extension that I put in the show notes as well. If you have watched it, it kind of shows you all of the kind of Easter eggs that were in there that you may have spotted, or some that actually we did miss when we were watching it. I did see the Gremlin graphics poster on his bedroom wall when he walked in. There's an episode set in there, CX. Obviously, Charlie Brooker was the guy that created the original Computer Exchange logo, and you see that in there. There's also PC Zone magazine that used to write for. Little glimpse of that as well. So, if you haven't watched it yet, like Ravi, well, I won't give you any spoilers, but definitely worth a watch of the new series of Black Mirror, episode 4 called Plaything, set in the 90s, and lots of classic retro gaming and tech Easter eggs in there as well. I'll link that article in the show notes as well. But this week, we're going to be chatting to someone actually who was right in the middle of all that, actually, creating games that were huge back in the early to mid-90s and beyond. Of course, he worked at the legendary id Software back in the day. Today, we're talking to American McGee.
Yeah, I can't believe we've got American McGee on the podcast. It's a a name that, I've always heard since I was a kid and has been associated with such amazing titles, but also that classic id Software period. Amazing story as well. I can't believe, John Carmack was living in his apartment. And in this interview, he's talking about who's this guy with this flashy car? What kind of job does he do? And then turns out, they were all working on Wolfenstein 3D, and he ends up joining Ed. It's just fantastic, the games that they've worked on, some of the inside knowledge from there, and also that connection with 9 Inch Nails as well.
Yeah, because it is a fascinating story. And actually, before we started recording, I always wondered if American McGee was actually his real name.
Yeah.
But it was, because his mum was like a hippie. And she named him that, inspired by a woman that she knew in college who called her child America, apparently. So, yeah, really interesting guy. And like you said, he the way he entered the video game industry, he was obviously a big gamer before he worked at id. And we talk a bit about his memories of the Commodore 64. But then, he was there at the absolute peak of id Software back then, just as Doom was in development, and then, worked on stuff like Hexen, Beyond Heretic, and obviously Quake as well. Then had quite a mysterious exit from the company that we talk more about, that actually turned out to be a bit of a blessing in disguise, because he went on to work at, some other huge companies after, obviously the Alice games that he's very well known for too.
Yeah, well, his name is at the very front of these titles, and you don't often get video game developers that have their name at the front. Alice was a great game as well, because it's all about, psychology and kind of history and mental health as well, and having that kind of built into a video game was something that was not done before, and it became a cult classic as well. You kind of dark follow-on to the fairy tale. So we talk about the origins of the game, and also, that was using the Quake engine, and that kind of connection that it had with id.
Yeah, so huge guest. I know you've been working on getting him on the show for well over a year, Ravi. So glad we could finally do it. American McGee, the id Software superstar. He's on the podcast in around half an hour from now. But of course, you know the way the podcast works if you're a regular listener. If not, this is what we do. First 25 minutes or so, we have a bit of a chat about what's been happening in the world of retro from over the last week. The big stories that have been making the headlines on social media. And actually, at the time we're recording this, which we are recording quite late this week, as Joe mentioned, a lot of holidays and stuff recently. We're recording this night before the podcast comes out on 24th of April. And today is actually YouTube's 20th birthday. It's blown anyone else's mind that YouTube's 20 years old now.
It's crazy. It makes me think how long we've known each other.
Well, I mean, going back to, it was 24th of April, 2005. Very first video on YouTube, which is still there. It's called Me at the Zoo. And it was uploaded by Jawad Karim, who is one of YouTube's co-founders. Billions of views on that video now. It's actually only 18 seconds long. I kind of took me back, actually, because, I mean, do you remember when... I was thinking when I first got into YouTube, and I look back on my channel, and... Because Ravi and I have obviously made YouTube videos. That's kind of how we met. But I think my first upload was at the start of January in 2008. So not long after it started.
Some of my first videos and then re-uploaded them later on.
Some of the ones that make me cringe are not public.
Oh God, yeah, there are some hidden ones. I know Joe has some hidden Guitar Hero.
They're not hidden. They're out there.
He's mentioned that they're out there.
I've been trying to find these for years. You won't give me the link.
I've got it's like a fan series that we did where I'm acting. There's like 2 seasons of that online as well. I'm not going to mention it. But,
oh my God, I need to find
screenshots.
That. I know you said you did that and you sent a screenshot, but I didn't realize there was like 2 seasons.
Yeah, it's huge.
We have some very clever people who listen to this podcast. So if anyone finds the links to either of these videos, I'd be curious to see them.
I need to see Ravi's.
We definitely do. But I mean, yeah, I was thinking back as well. I mean, who kind of got you into YouTube jokes? I know, obviously, you've followed retro gaming YouTube channels for years. Any early ones that you remember?
For me, I was probably quite late. I say late to the game. It would have only been like 2 years after YouTube came out. But to me and my mate Richard at school, like when we were finishing school and we were in sixth form, which would have been around 2004, 2005, we used to go on just like newgrounds.com and killsometime.com and stuff like that. I would watch videos on there. And then YouTube, I don't remember him ever being like, because I've seen people posting stories today of like, oh, I remember I was at uni and somebody was like, look at this, it's YouTube. That didn't really happen. I think he showed it me, but it was just like, he just linked it to me, in IT. It was just like, oh yeah, here's another thing you can watch videos on. And then, like I say, we got into Guitar Hero around the same time. And then around 2006, he modded his PS2 to play like custom Guitar Hero videos, and we started uploading them on YouTube. And it just never really like crossed my mind like that it was this like big thing or anything. And then it was actually, I was on game trailers. I used to go into game trailers every day and watch AVGN, like, and all those kind of videos which were originally on there.
Before the one on YouTube.
Yeah, and Screw Attack and stuff. And then I think it was around 2007, 2008, when I think it was at the end of like an AVGN video where it said like, more content on YouTube on Cinemassacre. So I guess the actual first YouTuber that I followed was AVGN, which would have been around about 2008. And then that's when I switched to watching everything on YouTube. I don't think I ever went back to anything else, and now I fall asleep every night watching YouTube.
There's 3 that I want to mention that were really early on for me. One was called Biff's Gaming Videos, and it's a guy called Biff Malone, and he'd done video game reviews in '94, and then he was kind of like uploading those onto YouTube.
Did you do Atari Jaguar stuff?
Yes,
I remember.
Biff Malone, and then there was another guy, Maximum RD, as well. He used to do like retro stuff. He used to also do like quite a bit of Amiga content and stuff, but he's been on there since 2008, I think. And also Paul Smallman as well. Paul is the best UK. I used to love his stuff. He still does uploads. I think he nearly does an upload every day or something of Spectrum titles, and he's still going. And these were some cool channels that were really there before stuff like got massive and blew up.
Well, I'm looking at, because I've actually found some of the YouTubers that I was into when I first watched YouTube. It's sometimes a bit sad when you kind of stop watching their channel, then you look at when they last uploaded a video. One was Dino the Legend 87, whose last YouTube upload was 15 years ago about his PlayStation 3. Channel is still there though. Another one that I got into really early was Steve Benway.
Yes, with his Friday talkies.
It's not a playthrough, not a review, just me playing the game badly, he used to say at the start. He hasn't uploaded a video for 7 months, it seems, sadly, the Retro Gaming Collector. A guy called Retro Gamer VX, I think he's from like Sunderland or Newcastle. And if you get those confused, people get very angry. Somewhere in the northeast anyway. He does loads of I'm looking at his channel now, he actually did a video a month ago. He does stuff like repairing old Amstrad hi-fis. And he did one with like the Quantel paint box and stuff years ago, I remember. Really good channel that is still active by the looks of it. Another one is a guy called Bluetonic78, who does a lot of like pickup videos, a lot of like snares and Mega Drive and Amiga stuff. His last upload though was a year ago. And then there's a guy called Michael's Retro Game Reviews I used to love. But again, his last video was 6 years ago. So it's, a lot of these people kind of just, do it at the early days and then just kind of vanish. But
it's a different world, isn't it? We had dislikes and it was a star rating system and stuff. And it's developed over 20 years to kind of become the main thing as well. Really interesting. And I kind of find it, I don't know, it seems like YouTube never deletes videos as well. Stuff on there from years and years and years ago. I guess there must be a point where they, delete it when it's not got a certain amount of views or something.
Oh, I hope not. But as we know, that does happen, stuff like GeoCities and that. I remember when Yahoo just killed that off, deleted all the data. But you imagine how big Google's server farm must be for YouTube. They've actually put together a blog to celebrate 20 years of YouTube. There's a couple of stats in there they mentioned. They said from that initial 19-second clip, there's now over 20 billion videos on YouTube. And there are 20 million videos uploaded every single day to the platform. So, from humble beginnings 20 years ago, YouTube definitely going very strong now. So, happy birthday, YouTube. 20 years this week. So, I'll link up that blog and a few of those channels we mentioned in this week's show notes. Now, here's a question that I didn't think I'd answer yes to until I read this headline, but now I'm thinking, actually sounds kind of cool. Have you ever wanted to run Windows on your Nintendo Game Boy?
Not really.
No.
No?
It sounds like the most boring car, isn't it? Like, someone would be like, I've got Tetris, I've got Windows.
Well, this is a Game Boy Color cartridge called GBS Windows Operating System V413. And it's created by someone called Ruben Retro. And there is a video on this you can watch, which is all in Spanish. But I've watched it with the YouTube subtitles on. And really it's not actually running Windows 3.1. This is more a tribute to Windows 3.1 that runs on the Game Boy Color, the Advance SP, the Analog Pocket as well, and some other systems too. Now, what do you guys think of this then?
Like you say, you think you've summarised it really well there. It's a tribute. I think the packaging and everything for it looks really cool. Like the physical cartridge with the box. Like I think he's captured the look of Windows 3.1, in the early 90s really, really well, and incorporated the Game Boy into it, into the artwork and stuff. I think that's fantastic. It's 40 quid. Currently sold out on his Etsy store, but there's going to be more coming. But it really is just kind of like a cartridge of like mini games. It kind of reminds me of more than anything. You've got Minesweeper on there. You've got a pseudo version of Paint on there.
Called Paint.
Which you can print off using the Game Boy printer, which is pretty cool actually. It's compatible awesome with that.
Yeah.
But for me, it just kind of looks like, one of these compilation like mini game cartridges. Which is based on Windows 3.1. But in terms of like the actual interface, when you load it up and stuff like that, obviously it isn't just a list of games. It does look a bit like it looks like Windows, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it's got the nostalgia in there. Definitely with the 3.1 look and stuff like having the DOS sequence loading at the beginning. And it's quite nice. I don't know if it would work as well with Windows 95 actually. And I think 3.1 is an area that it's kind of underused because it's got such a nice aesthetic, and I didn't appreciate it back in the days.
But yeah, I mean, this is something that's kind of been done before, but I think the fact that this is running on a Game Boy does add some nice novelty there as well. There are some useful things on here as well, though. There is there's a chiptune music player. So like a version of Media Player that plays chiptunes. That apparently can also kind of pseudo multitask. It can play the chiptunes in the background even while using other apps on here as well. Yeah, again, I mean, this is something that was made using GB Studio, which has obviously been used for games mainly. But I think this does seem like, quite a fun little spoof of Windows and quite a novel platform to create it on, though. So I think it is quite cool. And like you said, Joe, the fact that it's sold out proves that there is a demand for it.
It needs a beeper speaker as well.
Yeah, I'm sure the Game Boy can emulate that easy enough.
Yeah, beeper mode.
Yeah, so if you want to get hold of that, hopefully some more coming on sale soon, but I'll link up the video if you want to watch it in this week's show notes and kind of run Windows in a way on your Nintendo Game Boy. Now, this story, as soon as I heard this the other day, I messaged you guys straight away going, WTF? But the more I think about it, maybe this could work. Now, it turns out, obviously, we've talked on the podcast before about all these kind of Sega franchises that they announced being turned into movies. Obviously, a lot of them we kind of announced and then we haven't really seen anything more. Remember the Golden Axe movie? It was apparently in development. Comic Zone as well.
Dragon's Lair.
Shinobi was another from Sega. Apparently they were adapting. Yeah, so it's this one is a game that, to be honest, didn't have the strongest plot back in the day. But apparently there is a big budget Hollywood version of Outrun coming to the big screen with Michael Bay and Sydney Sweeney attached to this.
In a world, one man must drive across California in a Ferrari.
With explosions. Michael Bay, come on.
From Michael Bay.
Well, that's the thing about this. I mean, Outrun doesn't really have a story apart from, you're driving in a race. So I guess it could be, you could attach any plot to this as long as there's car chases in it.
I didn't see there was a Need for Speed movie a few years ago as well with Aaron Paul from Breaking Bad. And I didn't see that. And I did remember thinking, Need for Speed doesn't really have much of a plot either. But I've not seen that, so I couldn't say what the plot was in that. And I was the same as you. I saw this and I was like, what? But like, and then I was like, oh, Michael Bay. And then I was like, you know what? Like, it makes sense. Like, it's going to be a silly, like, fast-paced action movie, probably with, like you say, with explosions and stuff. Like, it makes sense for it to be Michael Bay. That part makes sense for me. But the film itself doesn't really make that much sense. Like,
well, it's very loose. It's like a blank slate. You know, essentially, you've just got the car. You've got a female partner in there. You know, it's 80s. California.
I hope it is set in the 80s. That'd be cool.
And it's got to be a Ferrari in there. It's got to be a Ferrari.
Yeah, 100%. So, you know, there could be, and then, you know, what is it? Magical sound shower. You can have that come on at one point.
Yeah, played by like a heavy metal band or something.
And that'll be like the key chase sequence or something. But that's all you need. Like, everything else they'll hopefully come up with, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, again, there's some people who mentioned in the comments that it's no different to the, 10,000 Fast and Furious movies.
Yeah.
So, kind of why couldn't they make it happen? The interesting thing there is Sydney Sweeney's in it, who I've seen in a couple of films before.
I don't know who that is.
Well, she's best known for Immaculate, apparently, which I don't know if that's a movie or a TV series. I'm sure my missus would know more.
I've not seen that, no.
It's a film, apparently, came out in 2024, horror movie. Actually, I think I did see that, actually. Yeah, I'm looking now at it. But apparently she's going to be the producer of it, but she won't star in the film. Now, people were kind of questioning that. But I looked up on Wikipedia, apparently she's like really into vintage car collecting.
Oh.
So, yeah, maybe she's on board to make sure that, the correct cars and stuff and era-appropriate stuff is in there.
Yeah, is Sega involved? Like, or they just kind of like sold the rights?
Apparently, the current Sega Corp president, Shuji Utsumi, is going to have a supervisory role overseeing the development of it.
Okay. I'm thinking they could go down like a Vice City style route. I'm thinking, a lot of these video game movies, people always think, it would be like a kid film or a fun action or something like that. But they could really it's so loose, they could just go into it and have a really adult outrun. Could be a really like Miami Vice style or something.
I think they'd have to go down that route because obviously there's
Scarface.
Movies like Sonic the Hedgehog and that just still appeal to kids today, and obviously Minecraft movie massive at the moment. But yeah, something like Outrun, my little 10-year-old nephew wouldn't know what it was. So I think if they're using that brand, surely it's got to be aimed at kind of people that remember it, what it is. It hasn't been an Outrun game really for a long time. Although that does also excite me that, if this does come out and also, if it does end up being a big budget, smash it at the box office, maybe Sega will make a new Outrun game.
Or just re-release it again.
Yeah. I've only bought it about 50 times. So, but there were some of the later Outrun games like Coast to Coast and stuff and Outrun 2 and some of those are really good. So I think even, just bringing those to kind of, PlayStation.
We just need Road Rash, the movie. That would be.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't surprise me with some of the other random ones I've announced over the last few years. Wasn't there like a Missile Command movie at one point that they announced as well? There's so many that we've talked about over the last decade that kind of nothing happens. But I think this one
through the 470 odd episodes and see which ones we've discussed and then mark it if they actually came out.
I'm sure someone could feed it into an AI, the transcripts, and probably do it in 10 minutes. But yeah, I think it just had like quite a plausible idea for a film, and the fact that these kind of well-known names are attached to it. Although I think Transformers 3 was the only movie I've ever walked out the cinema to.
I've never walked out of the cinema, but I fell asleep during the Total Recall remake.
Right, yeah.
I remember falling asleep because it was terrible. And then I woke up and he was fighting Bryan Cranston. I was like, what's going on?
Start eating your popcorn again.
Yeah. And, that's saying something because of around 2010 to 2020. So, yeah, about 10 years, I actually had a cinema card, like an unlimited card. And me and my wife went to cinema like 3 times a week. So we saw everything. And that's the only film I've ever fallen asleep in.
Well, Transformers 3, I was technically homeless when that came out because I moved out of my flat that day, and then I was moving somewhere else the morning after. So, and I was going to work on the night. I worked night shifts then, so I had like about 6 hours to kill before I did my last night shift and then moved to a new city next morning. So I basically had about like 12 hours to wander around London. So I went out for a bit of food, went to see, I just thought I'd go to the cinema to kill a bit of time before work on the Sunday night. And the only thing I thought Transformers 3 was on. So I watched it and it ran. I got a feeling it was almost 3 hours long. And I remember getting about 2 hours in, like numb behind, sitting on the seat thinking, it was literally just Michael Bay, explosion after explosion after explosion. I thought, I'll just go wander around Covent Garden or something else, anything else to get out of here. So, yeah, if he is going to make this, then please keep the running time reasonable. We don't want a 3 hour outrun movie. But yeah, looks pretty cool, though. Some big names attached to that. So fingers crossed it'll be decent. We'll keep an eye on that. Now, something that I think looks very cool, as someone who is really enjoying the point and click adventure game revival in recent years, and Ravi and I were at the Debug Live Awards in Nottingham, Indie Game Awards last month. Actually saw a load of indie developers like showing off point and click adventures. Seem to be really hot right now, don't they, for the indie scene?
Yeah, really good. And I'm kind of glad the genre's popped off again, because for years it disappeared.
Yeah,
and it's such a huge part of my youth, and also it's a great way of playing games as well, because you're kind of forced to slow down and actually think and use your brain.
Always loved a good point and click. I mean, thinking back in the day, obviously the Monkey Island games, love Loom. That was one of my favourite, all the LucasArts titles back then. I was playing Grim Fandango, the remake of that on the Plane to America, on the Switch a couple of weeks back.
I was a big Leisure Suit Larry fan.
Yeah, the first game I did like. Yeah, I kind of lost interest after that. Simon Says Beneath a Steel Sky. That was an awesome game back in the day. So it is nice to see these games coming back. And this one is a new PC point-and-click game, heavily retro-inspired, coming out in a couple of weeks' time on the 13th of May, called Neon Hearts City. What do you think to this then, Ravi?
I really like the colour palette choice. I think it looks really beautiful. It's got good voice acting as well, which... I kind of love voice acting. I know some people enjoy just the text on screen, but through the trailer, it does sound like it's been really well done. And, there's a lot of dystopian future cities and stuff like that in games, but this one kind of looks like one that I want to live in. It looks a bit depressing, but not gone too far. But also it's a good tale of a private investigator. And, some of the classic ones, even with Police Quest was one that I used to play quite a lot as well. What was investigating or finding out crimes and stuff is really, staple of point and click adventures.
Yeah, I love the colour palette in this as well. Kind of reminds me a bit of like Degeneration.
Yes.
And the look of it. Obviously that kind of cyberpunk.
A bit Day of the Tentacle as well. A bit.
Well, in terms, it kind of looks like... It doesn't remind me of kind of the early 90s point and click. I'd say it's more like mid to late 90s in terms of the aesthetic. Some nice big sprites in here. Quite a rich colour palette in here too. And like you said about voice acting though, Ravi, I'm with you there. If I go back and play some of the older games, I always try and find a talkie version of them. They just feel a bit sparse without the voice acting now.
Yeah.
So
and you used to have that option as well, didn't you? Voice. Yeah. Or no voice, and I always kind of went for voice, but it would usually be with like a slow loading CD-ROM drive, so every sentence it'd be like and then you get your thing, so it's quite nice to have it on modern hardware.
Yeah, and I'm hoping, with this, I'm looking at this, it would probably be possible to get this running on retro systems as well. And a lot of these kind of, people do demakes of them for ScumVM, that kind of thing, which will be cool. But again, this is a PC-only platform, but really, like I said, I did play Grim Fandango and Return to Monkey Island on the Switch, just because it was like the platform I had on me at the time when, I was on a 7-hour flight or whatever.
Yeah, I did Thimbleweed Park on Steam as well on PC. Yeah.
That's the thing, they feel better with a mouse, don't they? These kind of games, I think. So I think this, I'm looking forward to getting hold of this. It will be one that I get my hands on. It looks really cool. So if you're a fan of point-and-click adventure games in that kind of retro aesthetic, the game's called Neon Hearts City. Only a couple of weeks to wait until 13th of May. And I'll put the trailer in this week's show notes along with all the rest of the stories. Now, obviously, it is nearly the end of the month. We have got our Patrons Hangout coming up this Sunday, with it being the final weekend of April. Patrons Hangout, if you haven't joined us for one before, it's basically a massive Google Meet call. It's a bit like Zoom if you haven't used it before. Big video call. All our patrons are welcome. We geek out for 2 hours on a Sunday night, end of the month. Talk about anything, it can be pickups, which is often a big part of it, what people have acquired this month. We do kind of a bit of a help as well, a help section there. People if they've got questions, or I find a load of advice from the really intelligent people that we have in our community. We often just veer off into other topics as well, retro media, mobile phones.
We have games developers in there as well sometimes, which is always pretty cool.
Yeah, so a great bunch from all around the world as well. So we're going to be doing our Patrons Hangout this coming Sunday evening. If you want to get an invite to that, sign up to our Patreon right now. All the details are at theretrohour.com. If you're a gold member or above, you'll also unlock our bonus podcast that we do just for our gold members and above, which is called the Retro Hour After Hours. And the latest episode 47, our top 5 games of the greatest year in gaming, which was a fun one to do. And there will be a new episode of that will land last month. You also get access to a patrons-only area of our Discord server. You get the normal podcast ad-free and early.
Video interviews as well, which has started to become a thing. And Dan has, proposed to me and Joe that we're going to try and do a full show on video for the patrons. So that should be interesting.
We're doing what we call a public beta. So the last kind of month's worth of interviews that we've done on the podcast, you can watch the video versions of those on our Patreon right now. Next week or two, we're going to try doing the news as well. So if you want to give us your feedback on that and get access to it, all the details to sign up and join our wonderful patrons community are at theretrohour.com. We've got a few extra news stories on the way just for the patrons, but we have got a couple of new ones to welcome this month. 2 new patrons, so let's induct them into the most prestigious high score table in the world of retro gaming, and that is the Retro Hour Hall of Fame.
Hall of Fame!
I'll let you guys welcome them. Who we got first, Ravi?
Ellie Wood.
And Steve R.
Welcome. Really appreciate you joining our wonderful patrons community. If you'd like to join as well, all the details to help out the podcast and make sure that we can keep the lights on and keep new episodes coming out every single Friday. To join Patreon, all the details are at theretrohour.com. Now that it is almost the start of May, obviously summer, not far off. I've had my legs out today, got my shorts on. Admittedly, it was a bit nippy walking through town earlier, but summer means retro events, doesn't it? That's the thing that we look forward to. And there's pretty much something on every other weekend throughout the summer. So we had a little idea, because we got a lot of people reaching out to us going, can you mention my event? So if you have got a retro gaming or computing event coming up anytime, why don't you drop us an email with some information and we'll give you a free mention on the podcast. So the email address is show@theretrohour.com. show@theretrohour.com. We'll try and do a mention every couple of weeks for what's happening. But we have got a few that are on the calendar already. There is obviously a big one that has been going several years now, happening on May 31st in Hayes, not far from London, at Retcon 2025, which is on at the Barnhill Community Centre. They've got traders there. They've got systems from the 70s to today. They're going to be doing an Amiga 40th celebration there. And there's also going to be FPS battles, head-to-head Quake and Unreal Tournament as well. Some special guests there as well. So if you want to check that out, I'll link up their website for tickets in the show notes. There's a virtual one coming up as well in June, Ravi. What are the dates for this one?
Yeah, I've got to do this in a cool radio voice now.
You've always got a cool radio voice.
This is the PT1210 Weekender, which is if you're into your Amiga mod music and tracked music, there's a whole weekender for people to see different artists DJing, performing, playing online. And it's been running for 9 years, which is pretty amazing. This one's called Ancient Technologies, and it's got an Egyptian theme. And that's on the 6th and the 7th of June, and that's at ptweekender.com. Headlining it is going to be Cetrix and Hoffman as well. I'll be DJing too. Extra Spike Michael or Extra Spicy Mike. And Cy Goes Retro is also going to be DJing, and a load more. So it's a whole weekend of DJs, so check that out.
You can watch it from the comfort of your own house as well. You don't have to go out. Yeah, live stream on that. So, and finally, Retro Messe. That's going to be on at Sandefjord in Norway. Again, the 11th year of Norway's biggest retro event, happening August 16th to the 17th. Retro Messe is always incredible. You've heard us talking about it before. You've heard us bring you panels from there, traders, systems to play on, and talks with industry legends hosted by us guys, because Ravi and I are heading out there again to host the panels.
And, they've introduce the first guest who's going to be coming, and that's Richard Jaquays, and he did some pretty amazing games. The music for Jet Set Radio Future, Little Big Planet 2, Overwatch 2 as well, Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. So yeah, it's going to be a good one.
Yeah, worth a trip out to Norway. It's only about an hour and a half flight from the UK as well. So Retro Messa in Sandefjord. If you want to check out any of those events, I'll put links for tickets in this week's show notes. Okay, well, thank you for checking out the news this week. We'll have more for you, of course, on next Friday's podcast. And next, going to be talking to this week's special guest, the legendary American McGee, next on the Retro Hour podcast.
You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and we're here today with American McGee, and it's amazing to have him on the show. You know, he's done some absolutely awesome titles. Of course, id. There's some great games there. Doom, Quake, some classics, and also Alice, which is a really, really amazing game that kind of had that fairy tale gone dark aspect to it, and also Alice in Madness Returns as well, which we're going to talk about. How you doing, American?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for inviting me. I know it might have been a year that you've been sending emails to try to get me on. So yeah.
Persistence works.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, great to have you here. We've got a question that we ask all our guests, and that's what was your first kind of memory of video games, or your first video game experience that really stood out to you?
I think the first time I played games was on something called an Odyssey, which was a console back in the day with a little spinny controller, and you had things like Pong on there. I remember that back when I was still, just a boy, but it was at someone else's house because my family couldn't afford such a thing. But I remember that being the first time I ever interacted with games, and I was, of course, instantly attracted to it. And I wanted that friend to then be my best friend so I could go over to his house all the time and play games with him.
Yeah, that was a Magnavox, wasn't it?
That's right.
The Odyssey. Yeah, nice machine.
What about your first personal machine then? What was that?
So the first personal machine I had access to on a regular basis was actually something called a Timex Sinclair 2000, which was something you plugged into your television and you could program in BASIC. And it had, I think 16K of RAM or something. I mean, just super, super tiny. And you couldn't really do much with it. I think they were sort of trying to sell it as a advanced personal calculator or something like that. I'm not really sure who the target audience was. I do think it failed pretty rapidly, but it gave me my first taste of actually programming things. Nothing, terribly sophisticated, but that was something that you could also build very simple games on. And I think that was the first time I had that experience of creating things for myself. And then that led into having things like Commodore 64s and just, on and on into the PC era.
You mentioned the Commodore 64 there, which, probably my favorite machine of that era, of the 8-bit era. What kind of stuff were you doing on your Commodore 64 then? Because obviously it had, very, very powerful audio for the time, and the graphics were fantastic on that machine with its hardware sprites. What kind of stuff were you doing on it?
Well, I mean, you say powerful audio. I just remember listening to all the various MIDI remixes of Tubular Bells or, whatever you could download. And of course, download speeds were on, 200 baud or 300 baud modems, and you were saving things to tape. It was a pretty different experience, but it did at that time give me access for the first time ever to things like BBSs. So you could actually interact with other people who were also messing around and either writing their own programs, or oftentimes they were exchanging various games or tracks of music to play with the MIDI and the, sort of synth capabilities of the system. And I messed around with all that stuff. I remember, that my mom mistakenly thought that grounding me to my room was some sort of a punishment. And I look back at the fact that, like many kids, as boys growing up, I was probably, 10, 11, 12 years old. And I was doing all kinds of crazy stuff, playing with gasoline in the backyard and setting my mom's garden on fire. And she would say, all right, you burned my garden down. Now you're grounded to your room for 2 weeks. And I wouldn't really be upset about it. I would go in there and just stay on that computer and interacting with the world outside via this very slow modem connection and writing programs on my own. And I think that I'm fortunate for having been naughty enough to require that kind of grounding, which then led to having all that time to mess around and teach myself a lot of the things that became foundational to where I went later on in life.
I think that's really interesting that kind of C64 was a bit of an escape. And I was wondering which titles you were really into. I read that you were like Zork and Ultima.
I don't know if I remember the specific titles. I remember titles where you're adventuring around in a desert here or in a jungle there. And but I wasn't playing a lot of games at that period, to be honest. I didn't have access to that many games other than what you could download, which tended to be relatively simple things. And even when I was messing around with computers later on in school, they often limited your ability to play games on those computers. And it was really more about lessons and then also about teaching us things, related to programming. But yeah, I mean, of course, the Ultima games and, Logan's Run and, things like that. They looked amazing in the box packages, but of course, when you actually played them, oftentimes they were just very simple, 2D top-down type of adventures.
Yeah, your imagination had to do a lot of work.
This is very true, which I think, up until recent generations has always been the case. I'm always amazed when I go back and look at something like Doom, or Wolfenstein even before that. But I mean, it's a 320 by 200, pixel thing that's going on the screen now. And now your brain looks at it and thinks it just looks like a pile of mush. I'm sure if I showed that to my kids, they'd be like, what is this? Yeah. But for us back then, our brains spent a lot more effort trying to fill in the blanks. And it looked at that time, it looked incredibly realistic. Of course, we look at it now and it just doesn't look like anything.
You mentioned Wolfenstein 3D there as well, which, before you worked in the industry, you're working at an auto shop. Is that correct? I mean, were you using games as like every hour, outside of work as a distraction? I mean, Wolfenstein 3D, obviously that was a bit of a benchmark at the time.
So that was kind of the really insane thing about the transition into the games industry was at the time where I met John Carmack and was invited to go to work for it. I was working at an auto repair shop and they specialized in Volkswagens and, German and Swedish, Volvos and this kind of thing. And I had in that shop a 286 that I had asked the shop to purchase for the sake of being able to create invoices and track work and things like that. And I had also said to the guys running the shop that I would build an inventory management system for them. And so I began working on this thing that was going to link up with the sort of Volkswagen master catalog parts system and then keep track of what was in the shop and then make a note to order stuff in order to keep stuff on the shelves, what was needed there. So when I went down to the swap meet to buy this 286, the guy that sold the computer said, here's this new hot thing called Wolfenstein. And so when I brought this computer back to the shop, I plugged that in and it blew my mind. Just the fact that it was so immersive and amazing. Of course, as we said, I'd been playing a variety of other games up to that point, but until that point, we really hadn't had that sort of immersive running around inside of an environment type of game to play. So I remember on my lunch break, I'd kind of split my time between working on this inventory control program and playing Wolfenstein. Whenever anybody came over and looked to see what I was doing, I'd switch back to the work. But if there was no one there, I was playing Wolfenstein. And then lo and behold, it turns out that the guy living in my apartment complex was the guy that had made this game. So as soon as I met him and understood what he was, it was quite a shock. It was like, wait a second, you're the guy that's the game that I'm playing, there at work. So that felt like a really small world at that moment.
So John Carmack was one of your neighbors then, was he?
Yeah. So I lived in an apartment complex, and a friend of mine named Chris Chester lived in that complex as well. And he and his partner were John's direct next door neighbor. They, their doors were right next to each other. I lived in another part of the compound, but when I would go to visit Chris, then John would often be somewhere in the vicinity. And of course, they became curious about him as a neighbor immediately because he would come home driving in a Ferrari. And I remember early on, we were speculating, what is this guy? Why does he drive a Ferrari? But he's living in this relatively low rent apartment complex, which seemed kind of odd. And his license plate at that time said IDTEK, ID Tech. And so we thought, well, maybe he's a PI because he's driving this car that looks very much like the one that Magnum PI drove in the TV show. And we speculate. Anyway, we finally met him and found out that no, he's in fact running a game company. And then he began inviting us up to the office to test the games, and then eventually he asked me to join full time.
That's always a kind of a thing with early successful video game developers buying a flashy car. We've had so many stories of people doing that, and they usually crash them as well quite early on. I was wondering what the setup was like at id then. What was the kind of place like? Was it a basement that people were just all kind of working in, or was it an office? Or?
It was on the 6th floor of, I guess, a 10 or so story tall building in Mesquite, Texas, which is one of the only office buildings with any height to it at that time. And Mesquite, Texas, when you drive in there's a big sign that says, "Welcome to the rodeo capital of the world." So, I mean, it's not, at that time, it wasn't known for high tech. It was known for cowboys and rodeos. And the office itself was just as nondescript as you could imagine. But, glass, looking out to the world outside, to the freeway, to the shopping mall across the road. It was a typical kind of office environment, nothing really special about it. But, in the cubicles were at that time, 6, 7, 8 guys that were working on various, programming or level design. And, it was sort of, it had a kind of boys, dorm room kind of feel to it, a little bit disheveled, little bits of tech and sound cards and whatnot, strewn about. I mean, it wasn't kept incredibly, clean. But it wasn't, empty pizza boxes everywhere either. It was sort of a place that you felt there was a purpose, and that they were at a purpose, right, to get stuff done. So, it was a place when you walked in, everybody felt very focused, and they seemed that they had a mission, and that the place itself was sort of built for that mission.
You joined when Doom was kind of starting, and was it established by the time you joined?
When I started beta testing, I was testing on Doom. Okay. So Doom was already heading towards the end of production, and when I was hired as Doom was launching, and then initially I was doing tech support. So you would call and we'd say, thank you for calling id Software, what's the problem? And then we would diagnose problems related to Doom. And then it became clear that the two of us who were doing that, myself and Sean Green, were not going to be sufficient manpower for the amount of success that the game was experiencing. And so that was eventually outsourced, but we were moved. He transitioned into doing programming, and I transitioned into doing level design. And so that was around the start of the production, the development on Doom 2, which is why I ended up having, contributions to level design in Doom 2.
Were you a fan of the overall kind of heavy metal look of it, and Adrian Carmack's art style as well, and like that kind of darkness around it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when I was younger, I was what you would describe as a goth when I was in high school, and I was listening to music that very much aligned with the aesthetic of what they were doing in the game. And I was sort of, because I was raised in a very strange environment. On the one side was a heavily religious, fundamentalist Christian family, which is where my half-sister lived and where I spent my summers. So I was being exposed to very heavy Christian religious indoctrination. And on the other side, living with my mom, she was, what you describe as a liberal hippie. That side of the family was pot smoking, creative, just not exactly aligned with, right? So I had one foot in both of these interesting camps. And as a result, I had a fairly, I don't know about cynical, but I had a creative view on the world, and I had a creative view on things, notions like hell, the philosophy of hell. And I remember getting in trouble with the religious side of the family because the T-shirts that that we wore as people working at id would say things like "Go to hell" on the back. And I remember my sister's family getting mad, and I said to them, "But you don't understand. You're going down there to kill the demons, right? You're doing the Lord's work." But by that time they already had seen where I had gone culturally, which aligned very, very much with the sort of horror, the sort of goth, dark, aesthetic, that type of art, that type of movie. They weren't surprised, but I wasn't invited over there very much more after that.
I love that. Next time I play Doom, I'm going to think I'm doing the Lord's work. That's going to stick with me, that is.
Well, you are. This was always the thing that kind of made me laugh, was the people who would be, sort of up in arms about the game, and you'd say, "But you're fighting the demons. You are killing those guys." So, what side does that put you on?
I know, obviously, Doom was a big seller of PCs at the time. I remember, I was a Commodore Amiga user back then. Had a lot of friends that owned them. Then suddenly, one by one, they all started buying PCs when Doom came out. But there were some console ports as well. I know, in particular, id Software put quite a lot of effort into the console port of Doom to the Atari Jaguar, which is generally considered one of the best ports of Doom to a console at that era. Have you got any memories of that then, and the amount of effort that went into getting it running on the Jaguar, and what did you think of that system?
I sat one office over from John, and so oftentimes he would try to invite me into his thinking as he would think out loud, which, he was looking for a sounding board, but he might as well have been talking to the dog, for a lot of stuff that I didn't understand about what he was saying. I do remember that this kit came in, the development kit, and it was a fairly big piece of kit, as opposed to, what the final size of the production hardware was. And I remember that was sat on the pool table, if I remember correctly. But that was, I think, for the most part, John by himself doing that work. I don't think that there was much involvement from the rest of the team. There may have been a few places where we had to do simplification of geometry in the levels, if I remember correctly, but I don't think that it really went beyond that. That was pretty much a one-man job that John undertook to port that over.
Yeah, it was done very quickly as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah, that's right. He got in there, did it in a few weeks or less, and then was done. But yeah, I remember having the thing in the office, and I remember that the rest of us would play through it looking for visual anomalies and crashes and things like that as John was working on it. But, back then, that was one of the really interesting things about working in the presence of someone like John, was that, games were still simple enough, and he's obviously brilliant enough, was then and still is. But the technology at that time was still simple enough, and game production was simple enough that you could have this sort of one-man do-it-all machine who could just go and do a complete port job like that by himself, or could write an entire rendering engine by himself, or could rewrite someone else's work that had taken them months in a night by himself. And of course, games have become so much more complex now. I'm not sure that he's still capable. I'm sure he's capable. I'm just not sure that the technology is accessible in that way any longer. But back then it was, and it was pretty interesting to witness that kind of rapid development of technology that he was able to do.
Well, I have seen some videos on YouTube of the id offices in that era, and it looked like multiplayer death matches were quite a common theme on evenings and weekends. Did you get involved in many multiplayer matches, and how good did you get at the games compared to
that was the really crazy thing about the work ethic combined with the types of products that we were making, was that, we would oftentimes be in the office for 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And that was a nonstop Monday through Friday kind of thing. Especially working around John Carmack. He's really just a work machine, right? So he inspired in the rest of the team a similar sort of you got to be in the office all the time. But the thing that I think a lot of people don't understand was that we might have had, in a given day, 6 hours or 8 hours of focused work producing level content or creating sound effects or whatever it was that people were doing. But the rest of the 8 hours in a 16-hour day was spent playing deathmatch. And there was a huge amount of time spent playing the games as we were developing them. And I think that, you know, I remember there were times where people like John Carmack might have felt a little bit of frustration that the office often descended into these giant deathmatch, you know, just big, long free-for-alls that went on for hours. But I think that one of the benefits from that was that these maps that we worked on got incredibly well tuned, as did a lot of the mechanics for the weapons and the sounds that were triggered as you moved around the maps, and just a lot of the notions of like what deathmatch was and what made deathmatch fun and interesting came out of this constant playing and iterating and playing and iterating. And I think that's why when those games were released, the deathmatch element of them felt so fun. It felt so polished, was because huge amounts of time were devoted to playing and iterating while we were developing.
Well, obviously Wolfenstein 3D and then, you know, Doom even more so were massive hits. What are your memories of Quake when that was in development? And was there big pressure for it to deliver again and have like a third hit?
At the point where we started work on Quake, I guess that we understood, like everyone in the office kind of understood that we were now within some realm of, you know, developer celebrity, I guess you could say. And that there were expectations and that there was pressure and that there were, you know, that there was an expectation of releasing something that would achieve a certain level of technological advance and quality and things like that. But, it was, I remember that John took me aside to start work on the tools for Quake, the level editing stuff, and QC, the scripting language, prior to, I think, Doom II being complete. And I just remember that once I started messing around in the tools and he got the first iterations of the renderer up and running, and you actually had a 3D space with much more complex geometry, and of course geometry on top of geometry, a true 3D, you know, 6 degree of freedom whole, which the world at that point, I mean, outside of tech demos or rendering engines that were specific to animation and things like that, you know, for running around with proper physics and all that, didn't really exist. And I just remember that as we were building in the early tools, you already knew that this was going to come out and be leaps ahead of anything else that was out there. There was an awareness of, you know, competition from Epic that, you know, Sweeney was sort of John's evil twin. I don't say evil like that. I just mean we understood from the id office that John had a sort of technological doppelganger, right? Somebody who could probably keep up with him and produce an engine that could keep pace with, or even best, whatever was happening in our office. But at the moment that Quake began development, we had this sense that, hey, we're in the lead and something really fantastic is going to form from what's being done here. And once the tools were put into the hands of everyone else in the office, and as the tools evolved, as we were developing, it was just every day that someone would take you aside and be like, oh, come look at this. Come look at how these skyboxes work. Look at how the particles do this. Look at how, you know, the doors and this. I mean, it was just, you know, look at how the AI of the creatures, look at the knock-on effects of, you know, physics plus exploding barrels plus creatures plus, right? And it was just this constant kind of like, just wow, you know, you felt it, just wow, this is really great. We're building something that the world has never seen before. And I think that took a lot of the pressure off to answer your question. During the development of Quake 1, as I recall, it went fast, it went fun. You know, there were bits of it that were kind of foggy, you know, what was the story? Like what was going on? But it didn't matter because we had rocket launchers and we had monsters to blow up and we had really beautiful environments in which to do it. And that at the time felt like it was enough.
I remember the involvement of Nine Inch Nails as well. What was that like, them being involved with Quake? And also later on you had Nine Inch Nails involved with Alice as well.
Yeah, that was cool. I mean, they sent a fax, I think it was a fax, to the office at one point and said they were going to be doing a show in Dallas, and invited us to that. So at that time, I was already a huge fan. John was as well. And we would listen to their music all the time before the invitation. So being invited by them was like, again, it was like one of those moments of like, are you kidding? This is so amazing. You know, we love these guys so much. And we met with Trent, met Verena, met the rest of the band, and we hit it off. They proposed almost immediately that they wanted to find a way to collaborate. And so there was the usual sort of, wrestling match between the lawyers and the biz managers and things like that to sort something out. But once the deal was sorted out, it began a process of developing the game alongside them creating sound effects and music. And it was just really cool. I mean, it was like they were fully on board for that project, for the duration of the project. I was flying down to New Orleans every couple of weeks to work with them directly and bring back hard drives full of music and sound effects and all kinds of cool stuff, and then integrating that stuff into the game. So it was really a lot of fun. They put a lot of passion into it. There was a lot of humor during the development of a lot of the stuff that they did. And for me personally, it was a lot of fun because I was the conduit between what was being done in New Orleans. And then also I was the one responsible for integrating all the sounds and all the music and stuff into the game. So I had a very hands-on with Trent and the guys, and also with the tech, and also building the levels around what was coming back from them. So it was a lot of fun.
Did that really help with the connection with Alice then as well?
Well, by the time I went on to create Alice. Yeah, I mean, I was still hanging out with the guys from Marilyn Manson, and I was still hanging out with Chris Verena, and it was actually Manson who I was visiting in Los Angeles at one point that I was talking to about game concepts, and I believe he was the one that said someone should do an Alice in Wonderland game. And, he and I also often talk about alchemy, which ended up being a big piece of what's contained in the Alice games. And I kind of brushed it off. And then I went back to Redwood Shores. I went back to San Francisco, and I remember driving in my car one day, and this song came on. It was by the Crystal Method, and it mentioned A Land of Wonder. And it was something about the vibe of that song. And then thinking back to having these conversations with Manson about, because we would talk about a lot of different properties and ideas for games. Alice wasn't the only thing that had come up in our conversations, but I didn't really see it when he mentioned it until I was in the car and I heard that song, and then it all kind of fell into place. This vibe, the style, and everything, and I got super excited. It was like I'd been hit by a bolt of lightning. Like, oh, I see it now. I get how this could work. And I rushed back and started work on it. So yeah, I mean, there was, throughout all of that, there was a through line from id and having met the Nine Inch Nails guys and developed a relationship with Manson, to these conversations that I would have with him about games and mystical stuff and all this, and psychology, that then led into this sudden formation in my head of like what this whole product could be.
Well, I mean, going back to id, I mean, when Quake came out, it was a massive hit. Quake 2 was in development, and then in 1998 you left id Software, and I've read various different stories about this online. I mean, what kind of happened from your perspective?
I don't know. I got fired, and to this day I'm not even sure exactly how it happened. I'm sure you've seen some of the theories that have been floated by various other former id guys. But I was taken aside one day during the initial conceptual work for Quake 3. And so I had been doing the conceptual work that I'd been asked to do. We'd finished up Quake. And so there was these series of sort of, I don't know what to call them. They were sort of conceptual tests, hey, American, go build some architecture, trying to come up with various ideas for doors and for levels and all this kind of stuff. And I was doing that, and I felt it was kind of odd because it was like I'd never really been tasked with tests in the past. Or with sort of conceptual challenges. It had normally just been, here's a texture set, here's a theme, go do what you do, right? And at that time, I mean, and even today, if you go and you look at what people talk about when they talk about the levels that I designed, I think I was pretty good at level design. I was fast, and I thought I had a fairly consistent style, and a style that people liked, and I thought that my levels were eminently playable. If you look at the rankings that people talk about, which are their favorite deathmatch maps, a lot of times, mine are up there. And also just in terms of the breadth of the content that I contributed. So if you look at the number of maps that I did for Doom 2 or for Quake 2, and in addition to the amount of work that I put into integration of sound effects and music and the work that I did down there, developing sound effects and all that kind of stuff, like, I didn't feel like I slacked. So it was a little bit, and I also didn't feel like there should have been any question about, like, what does this guy do? Like, it was pretty obvious what I was capable of doing. So I felt it was a little bit odd that I was being tasked with things that kind of felt like, hey, we'd like to test you for your abilities. And okay. Anyway, apparently I failed that test because at one point I got called into the art room where John Carmack was sat with Adrian Carmack and Kevin Cloud, and they said, we're letting you go. And I remember asking why, and they gave a non-answer. It was sort of like, it's just not working anymore, this sort of thing. And that was it. They didn't want to discuss it. They didn't want to reconsider it. I remember I started crying because it was a shock. I mean, like, it was an absolute emotional shock to come into work one day, feel that everything was relatively normal and that I had been doing good work, and then to be told, but it was like having your world turned upside down, right? Totally out of the blue, totally unexpected. And obviously, I mean, it wasn't a kind of situation where you've got a company that's in distress or they're trying to save money or anything like that, and also it wasn't a, hey, we're warning you, you need to straighten out XYZ or we're going to fire you. There's none of that. It was just one day everything's normal. And then one day they walk you in there and they go, you're done, you're fired. So again, I don't know. I don't know what happened. I still don't know to this day what happened. But I'll say that on the drive home, it was like this miraculous transformation. As I was driving back home from being fired, I went from having this sort of sense of dread and breaking down to suddenly thinking, oh my God, I'm free. Like, I don't have to go there and spend 16 hours a day under all this tremendous pressure. And I was like, oh man, I actually feel like I'm a bit burnt out of all of this, and I don't need to do that anymore. And I'm really glad to be free of it. So I had an almost immediate realization just on the drive home that I was glad to be free from it. So, and looking back, I'm exceptionally happy that they fired me. Like, I could not be happier, because, all the events that took place after that were fantastic, all the way up to where I am today, where I'm sitting today. I mark John Carmack as being one of the people most influential in my life in turning me towards something creative and interesting and wonderful. And I mark being fired from that phase in my life as opening the door to allow me to leave Texas and become a citizen of the world and make my own products. And so it's one of the reasons why I don't question it too much, and I'm not that bothered by it. So
yeah. Sounds like it might have been a bit of a blessing in disguise.
It turns out that most things are. It's one of my favorite Chinese parables, is this one about the farmer, and his son goes to ride a horse and breaks his leg, and he thinks like, oh, this is terrible, the son has broken his leg. And then the farmer says, let's wait and see. We don't know if this is good or bad. And the next day the army comes through and starts conscripting all the young men to go off to war. And it's like, oh, look, breaking the leg was a good thing, right? But then, of course, the farmer goes, let's wait and see. We don't know yet. And, the story just goes on and on and on like that. And that really is how life is.
Well, talking of change, you kind of went and joined EA. So before Alice, I was wondering what you were working on there.
So when I got hired to EA, I was actually working at the Maxis office in Walnut Creek, and I was going to work inside the same building where Will Wright and his team were developing The Sims. And so when I first got to that office, they would invite me into the design meetings for The Sims, but I was... I was a bad influence, I guess. Will and I got along really well. Like, I liked him a lot and he liked me. But the team around him, a lot of them didn't like me very much. So like when the Sims pee on themselves because they can't get access to a bathroom, those were the kind of ideas that I would suggest in those meetings, right? They started work on a concept for Sim Mars. And I think that was the kind of straw that broke the camel's back, because at one point they were talking about balancing out, as you're going to Mars and you have to use resources and you've got people there, but if they die, it lowers morale. I remember saying something like, well, wait a second, I've got a backhoe and I can dig holes, right? Yeah. And if I take these guys far enough away from the base and put them in a hole, the other guys won't know, right? So they would say, okay, American's not invited to the design meetings anymore because he keeps coming up with these weird ideas. Of course, sometimes they made it in and they were kind of funny, but, and that was initially. And then there was a whole period of time where, they hooked me up with, or I got hooked up. Actually, as I was working there, I also went off and was working with Michael Crichton on a thing that was eventually got called Timeline, which got made into a book and a movie and a game. And that was also in collaboration with EA, but that was a little bit later. So there was a period of time working with Crichton and his team on that, which led into working at the Walnut Creek office with Will. And then at some point, somebody from the big office, the head office, came over and said, hey, we think you're kind of, marking time here. Do you want to work on a project of your own? And that was the invitation to do Alice. And so at that time, I kind of searched around for a fairly, lengthy period of time trying to figure out what that would be until I finally hit on the concept for Alice, at which point they said, right, go ahead and do that.
That's really interesting that you were just given that kind of independence at one point and told to go with a project.
Absolutely crazy. I don't know what star I was born under that would allow such weird things to happen. I'm incredibly thankful to Rich Hilleman, who was the VP at EA in the head office there, that opened up that opportunity to me. I don't know what I did to deserve that, nor do I think a lot of times that I have the skill set to justify that sort of decision being made around me. But, they seem to have faith in the concept, and they hooked me up with a really good executive producer named RJ Berg, who, went on to become one of my best friends and my writing partner. He kind of completed the other half of the equation. So I brought, the core concept and the kind of the dark gothic, characters and all of this. And he brought the sort of dialogue writing to sell the story that I wanted to tell. Right. And then we actually lucked into being able to work with these guys in Texas that I'd worked with alongside at Rogue Software, Rogue Entertainment. And again, we were really lucky there because they were really good with the tools, with the Quake engine tools. RJ was really good with dialogue, and I brought this sort of concept, a vision, and all of us together managed to pull off something pretty cool. But why we were given that opportunity, why EA took that chance on us, I really have no idea. I think these days, they don't take those kinds of risks so much anymore. But back then, we just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
And I was going to say that Quake engine connection must have really helped, with your past experience on it, also the team, but then changing it to add different elements like platforming and puzzle in there must have been quite good fun using that engine in a different way.
Well, it was one of the things that I definitely came away from id feeling like I thought that the engines were being underutilized by the guys at id for what they could do. And of course, during that same period of time, we saw that the guys at Valve, had done Half-Life and introduced really, complex storytelling and intricate, interactions with the environment and things like that to the 3D gaming space. And that was very much in line with what I thought while I was at id that team should be doing, right? And to be honest, like a lot of the guys that did were very much in the sort of story in game is about as useful as story in pornography, right? That was a thought that existed at id in a very strong fashion. And so, that was another one of the reasons why when I was let go, I felt a kind of like freedom that, oh, hey, not being there means I have the opportunity to do some of the things that I think could be done with this tech. And of course, what EA handed me was that opportunity on a golden platter.
What were the reactions to doing a horror game? Because obviously in Alice in Wonderland, it's, thought of as a kid's kind of fairy tale. And obviously the game kind of focuses around her experiences, trauma, mental state as well. And the game actually got an M rating in the end too. So, I mean, was there any kind of feedback on that? Was anyone at EA worried about the concept being a bit too risky?
Oh, sure. I mean, famously, at that time, the CEO of EA held up the Alice game when it was finished and said, this is not the kind of thing we're going to be known for making, which pretty ironic given where they eventually went with violence in the games, being pretty graphic. But at that time, I believe that Alice and Clive Barker's Undying, they were neck and neck for, I don't know which one was the actual first M-rated game that EA ever produced, but one of them was. And there was internal pushback for sure. And market-wise, I remember that a lot of the retailers didn't want to carry the box that had a cover where she had a bloody Vorpal blade. They demanded that EA remove the blood from her and also to switch the knife for the ice wand. So, I mean, though, when you go back now and you play Alice, you laugh at the idea that that's an M-rated game because it's so tame, right? There's not a single human that visibly dies in that game. You're only killing monsters, and even the blood that is in there is very cartoonish, right? So I don't think that if you were to make that game as it was then, if you were to make it now, I don't think that people would suggest that it needs an M rating. It doesn't come across as an M-rated game. So obviously, morals and thoughts on that kind of thing have shifted a lot. But back then it was pretty controversial.
I think having that kind of personality and psychology in there was really interesting compared to someone like the Doom guy or, the main character in Quake that just goes through killing, like having a personality. We see a lot of that in games now, and we see a lot more kind of reaction, but it was one of the first type of games that really, really pushed that, I think.
Yeah, well, it's a topic that's incredibly interesting to me, and it all kind of stems from my past and, events that took place, when I was a child that then led me to be very interested in childhood trauma and in psychology. I mean, that's still the same thing that we're doing these days with the plush toys, right? And I'm glad to see that kind of stuff is being integrated more into games, these days. I think that games have the opportunity to have that kind of healing, introspective approach to them. But I think for a while there just wasn't you just didn't have the depth within the games to touch that type of stuff.
Obviously, when the game was released, it got very good reviews, and I've read for years, about there's going to be a movie version of Alice, and there's rumors that Wes Craven was connected to it. I think Sarah Michelle Gellar bought the rights at some stage. I mean, do you know what kind of happened there then? Because it's kind of remained in development hell, it seems, for many years.
I guess the problem with all of that was that around the time that the game was being released, there were some producers from Hollywood who came up and they purchased the rights to the linear media. So, when you have a property like Alice, you've got media rights that exist in two spaces. One is the interactive media, so that's going to be video games, and the other one is going to be linear media, which is going to be books, television, and film. So these guys came up and convinced EA to sell them the linear media rights in perpetuity. So they just lock, stock, and barrel. This company now owns these rights. I think there's some people at EA these days that regret that I think that they wish they had maybe put some sort of a time limit on the option for these guys to work with the property, but they own it outright. And I think that with every attempt to get a movie off the ground, what I've seen is that the people who own the rights seem not to understand what it is that the property is really about. And they don't understand who the audience is. And that leads to a disconnect between, let's say that, there's somebody at a studio that's considering that, oh, I love American McGee's Alice. I would like to see a movie made of this. And then when all is said and done and this, yet another presentation has been made for what that might be alongside a budget and a director and an act, it doesn't align with the expectations of the person that's purchasing or that's committing to fund this thing getting made, right? So, in other words, if you know what Alice is, but then once a pitch gets made, it feels like something completely different because there's a romantic love interest or some other elements in the story have been gutted. You'll say, but that's not what I came here to buy today. And I think that more often than not, I've seen that disconnect between what the product actually is, and at least the story in the game, and what gets pitched. That kind of makes things fall apart, and that's happened multiple times now.
Yeah, there's been after Alice, there's been lots of different kind of stuff that was proposed and stuff that was going to come out and everything. And eventually, we saw Alice: The Madness Returns as well. What was it like? Kind of working again on the brand and also being able to get stuff out. Because I can imagine with legal issues and stuff and EA, it must have been quite up and down for quite a while.
So when we worked on Alice Madness Returns, that was great. I mean, working with EA was great. I think it was John Rigatello he's a big fan of Alice. And, he's been a supporter of mine for a long time. He was the one that said, right, green light this, we'll let these guys go and make another game. At that time, I had moved out here to Shanghai, China, and I had built an independent studio of my own. And we had released a game called Grim using the Unreal Engine. And so we had experience under our belt doing rapid production and fairly high quality production. And we all, we were just kind of ready to plug and play. And so the experience overall, working with EA, with the team that we built up, all of that, it was great. It was one of the most fun projects that I've ever done in my life. We, of course, had our moments, ups and downs here and there. But I think in general, EA got what they set out to get. We converted their cash very efficiently into a very big and beautiful game. And I think that for myself and for the team, we got a lot of creative satisfaction. I met a lot of the goals I had for the story I wanted to tell. And I know that we also achieved pretty interesting stuff in terms of our artistic presentation, in terms of technological advancements that were made inside of the engine, things like that. So, I think the main thing is if you go back and you look at that game right now today, and you'll see that people are still playing it, it holds up really well. Narrative, it holds up. The visuals hold up. The gameplay, a little bit, I think that's the one place people feel it's a little bit shaky. But other than that, it doesn't look like a sort of, how old is it now? 15 years?
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah. So I think we did okay. And I think we had a lot of fun making it.
Would you ever like to revisit Alice and do another game in the series?
Not particularly. I'm sort of burnt out on game development in general. And I don't mean that from working with the team stuff. I like development. I like telling stories, but the sort of corporate interaction, the managing the money, managing a studio, all that kind of stuff is not particularly interesting to me anymore. And then I think also we're at a different time in terms of I just think the politics around games, story in games, the demands for representation, things like this, I'm too far out of touch with it because I've been living in China since 2004. So 2000. When did I move here? Yeah, 2004. So we're going on 21 years. And there's a lot of times I just feel like I'm too, how to put this? I can be my own worst enemy for not being sufficiently in touch with the sort of language of Western culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What are you up to nowadays then in China?
So we're making plush toys. A couple of years ago, I guess it's been five years ago or so, we launched a plush toy brand, and that was off the back of the Patreon that I was doing to try to get a third Alice game made. And at one point, we decided to make one of our Patreon rewards as the rabbit that she's seen clutching in the opening scene of the game. It's this distressed white rabbit that Alice holds. And so we made a plush toy of that, and they just sold out. They were just gone, And then we made another series of plush toys, and those just sold out. And suddenly I started getting requests from people who were saying, look, can you do something having to do with this or that anxiety, social anxiety, or medical issues, or LGBT culture, or just culture in general? And we continued basically taking requests for various designs, and came up with this notion of crowd design so that people could first request a particular design. And then as that design was being developed, it was the voice of the crowd that guided the development. And that's done very well for the business, though in the last year, we've sort of restructured and remodeled that, because as the brand became more popular and as those voices became louder, there also started to become a fair degree of, discordance. You sort of had factions that would fight with each other over what the proper design for something ought to be.
Well, American McGee, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of your memories. Really enjoyed the insights there as well. Sounds like you're enjoying life now too. I know you're talking about spending some time on the boat before we started recording as well. So I'm glad everything's going well for you out there, and keep up the good work. Thank you so much for coming on and being our guest.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to the both of you.